Hey, welcome back to Common Mansplaining. Eddie here, and I've got another reaction video for you. We're going to do a little something different this time. This one's going into the deep philosophical mode, right? So we're going to talk about Alex O'Connor, who was just on the program Jubilee, and they do this debate forum style called Surrounded. Now, for those of you who are not used to this style, I want to kind of give you a little preface, and that is the way that this style works is they got 20 to 25 people around in a circle around one guy in the center, and in this case it's Alex O'Connor, and the person in the center will make a claim, and then what the people at the edge will do, they'll race to the chair to get to be the person to debate with the person in the center, and they'll try to, hash it out. And then as they're speaking, they'll get voted off if they're just not performing well enough, or if, they're crazy or something. They're just not, if somebody else wants to get a chance, something like that. So they might be voted off. And as such, you'll have 3 or 4 people get an opportunity, maybe even 5 or 6, to get an opportunity to debate on a single claim, which usually has a 20-minute time limit before the next claim is made. Now, one thing I want to tell you about Alex O'Connor and this video is this is a claim about God. All of his claims are about God. We're only going to discuss one, and the one that we're going to discuss is regarding the problem of evil. For those of you who are familiar with philosophy, the problem of evil is basically, the concept goes, if there's so much evil in the world, how can God be omni-good or omni-benevolent? Now, one thing I want to say about Alex O'Connor, for those of you who are unfamiliar with his work, Alex O'Connor is an atheist, and he's an extremely intelligent atheist, like vastly more intelligent than the run-of-the-mill person you'll meet who's just not sure of God's existence, or doesn't quite have the faith that some of us do. And so, your faith has to be intact when you confront someone like this. Otherwise, he'll talk you right out of it. He's just very, very, very smart. He knows the Bible far better than most Christians. I think his IQ's got to be, up of 150, 160, maybe more than that. And so as a consequence, his memory is very, very good. So I'll freely admit that Alex O'Connor is a much better biblical scholar than I, but that's something I seek to shore up over the next few years. So I'm still studying, and we all have studies that we need to attend to. We all have crosses to bear. So that's the preface on Alex. Now, his specific claim is a little bit different than just the standard problem of evil, which, for those of you who are familiar with the problem of evil, you'll know that there's a storied tradition of theodicies in the church that are philosophical arguments that are meant to counter the problem of evil. And there are, of course, counters to those counters and counters to those counters to the counters. It goes back and forth, of course. This is one of the most discussed philosophical concepts in the history of mankind. But his specific claim is a little bit different. It is the claim that specifically animal suffering makes the existence of God unlikely. Now, also, for those of you who know Alex, you'll know that this is kind of like his theme, right? He's very, very against animal suffering. I think he's a vegan, or at least he used to be. And so animals and their care, their stewardship is very, very important to him. But it also puts an interesting twist on the problem of evil. So it makes it slightly different than your standard problem of evil conversation. But I thought it was really, really interesting, and I wanted to go into it and give you guys the opportunity to see me react in real time. So without further ado.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely. Good work.
Hey, by the way, it can get kind of bloody sometimes. These guys will race up to the chair, and whoever gets there first, I mean, sometimes they plow each other over and tackle each other just to get there.
And nice to meet you,
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why is suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, you know, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some, Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omni-benevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth. I
like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
So it's kind of an interesting premise that he begins with. One thing to note is that he's playing a little bit of a bait and switch game with them. And this is part of the problem with working with somebody so outrageously intelligent, is most of them aren't going to notice this. And one of the games that he's playing is, he's talking about two kind of situations. One is a situation where you assume a naturalistic, materialistic worldview, and one is a situation in which you assume kind of like the Christian worldview. And if you already assume the Christian worldview, and you know that the universe is a created phenomenon, then it might seem like evil is an odd thing, or suffering is an odd thing to incorporate into a universe created by an omnibenevolent God. But in reality, the way that he framed it is, I would actually argue against the way that he stated it in the first time, was that he claimed that, you know, if we had these two opportunities, these two possible worlds, one where there is a God and created a universe, an omnibenevolent God, and one where there isn't, I would say that the universe where there isn't a God, we wouldn't expect a universe at all. Like, we just wouldn't expect anything. We wouldn't expect a world with no suffering. We would just not expect a world. We would expect nothing. So it's kind of an odd bait and switch that he's playing there.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
And so I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
Can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that...
Okay, pause.
Nice to meet
you. So one of the unfortunate sides to this format is that you don't always get to see the conversation play out because of people voting each other off. That's a bummer.
Good work, Allison, man. How's it going?
Nice to meet you too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous or whatever
in particular, non-human animal suffering? Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists. Yeah. Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
I don't agree with that. I think most Christians do believe that animals have a soul. They may not believe that animals have a immortal soul. Most probably don't, but the soul can still be developed. So I'm not sure that that argument works.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I haven't even heard of this. Okay, the axiological expectation mismatch problem refers to a situation where there is a discrepancy between what someone expects to be good or valuable based on their personal values or beliefs and what they actually observe in the world, leading to a sense of conflict. Interesting.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
The kind of God that structured the universe around humans.
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection, such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Maybe, but that's not exactly what he's saying. What he's saying is that God is not trying to get involved directly. And maybe God does get involved directly. We know that God sustains our existence at all times, but, various different beliefs in God are all across the spectrum, from everywhere from kind of like a deism, which believes that God's kind of like a hands-off. He creates the world and then kind of rolls it downhill, and then whatever happens. In that case, you would absolutely expect suffering. You would expect whatever happens, because whatever happens is just it could be random, basically. But yeah, so I don't know that they're on the same page at the moment.
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table.
Okay.
But sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly.
Zebras.
Right. So they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. Sure. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not.
I'll tell you what I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can talk.
Do you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that.
Yeah, but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you say? What's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize justified unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. Well, you're probably talking about this post-mortem example.
Sure.
I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer
a bunch. Means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000. Yeah. But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
Yeah. So. Interesting argument. I don't know that I subscribe to this animal martyrdom concept. I personally don't think that animal souls are immortal like the human soul. I don't think they have access to the divine like we do. But it's a very interesting argument. I have heard of philosophers that attempt to deal with the problem of animal suffering in this way. They try to either they say that the animals don't feel pain, or that the animals are better for it at after death. They if somehow exist in a glorified manner. Not my personal philosophy, but yeah, he is right about the fact that Alex's value system doesn't necessarily align with most Christian value systems, or for that matter, with God's, right? So Alex is assuming a fundamental value that suffering is bad, right? And it's based around some interesting suppositions, not necessarily the case, right? Suffering often in human lives is a very good thing, right? I don't necessarily know how to play piano. I might suffer for the next 10 years trying to learn, but then at the end of that 10 years, be very happy for the fact that I had suffered, right? So even in death, I think suffering can be very, very redeemable. So you did have a point there.
Been voted out
by
the majority.
Awesome, man.
Return to your seat.
Good stuff.
Yeah, he's fast.
So close. Hey,
Nice to meet you.
how's it?
Hayden, how are you?
Hayden, nice to meet me.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But
See,
granted,
exactly what I said. So I thought it was funny that he made that misstep in the beginning.
the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay. Why does suffering exist at all? Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolved. In a world where not all of these pains are actually going to kill us, we're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying.
So that's
for it.
conjecture. It's important to note that that's conjecture. While I think that natural selection probably does exist, at least in some form, it's by no means really proven. Right. It's one of those things where it's just kind of like assumed because we all learn it in school. We all learn that, some form of neo-Darwinism where, survival of the fittest. And that's how, animal kingdoms have developed over time. I don't know that it's 100% proven, and I think we keep on revising it. As a matter of fact, I think Darwinism serves it stands in front of some serious problems and has been challenged by the scientific community in a serious fashion over the last couple of years. So I don't know that that's a conjecture that you can actually make.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true.
Then animals can't suffer. Unless you conclude that animals are conscious, which I don't know that we would call. I mean, we know that they're self-aware to an extent. We know that they are capable of forging some type of memory and processing information. But I don't think that's necessarily what we mean when we say consciousness.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness, but then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this. What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God, but the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures. Have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer, right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose?
If Christianity is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
so suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say here. Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals.
Oh, yes, it does. Non-human animals definitely develop over the course of their life. They learn how to fear the things that they need to fear. They learn stimulus and response just like we do, to that end, at least.
Said, right? That does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son has suffered and died immediately as a result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify. And we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all of these?
You might be able to justify an amount of suffering. Right, but the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia and they're dead,
could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
Then perhaps then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will of the Lord.
Not necessarily.
That seems
all right, boss.
No,
please return to your seat.
You're so cool.
Hey, he didn't have to fight for it.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm awesome. I would love to pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
If we're pulling back a little bit, I remember reading at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, that we can't trust our senses because evolution doesn't really care about making truth claims. It cares about surviving.
I don't know.
Do you agree with that?
I don't think Dawkins actually endorsed that argument, but it's a good argument. C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, the argument from reason, sure.
But would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I remain agnostic on what reason is, but I think it's a powerful argument.
When it comes to determining if suffering is wrong or right.
So, okay, so crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong. Outside of the senses that I, as an emotivist, will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique, right? Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. You don't have to believe that something's wrong, but if there is such a thing as objective morality, I don't think that it would consist in a God who oversees the amount of suffering that we have on planet Earth.
Timothy Keller does this story about no-see-ums. Have you heard of the no-see-um story?
No.
Yeah, so he says if you have a tent and you look in there and you say, hey, I think I have some dogs in the tent. Maybe, like, for example, I have a golden doodle. He's a killer. That was just a joke, but we can move on. And if I say, hey, I have a golden doodle inside the tent, you would expect to see one. But if I said, hey, there's some no-see-ums. These little gnats are so tiny they actually go through the screen.
Sure.
He says there's some no-see-ums in the tent. You might look in there and go, I don't see any no-see-ums. But of course you don't see no-see-ums because nobody can see them.
Okay, so
just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort. That doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets part of the way there.
That's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Agree.
Blessed is he who believes without seeing.
I think that.
All right, pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seats.
Sorry, Dan, more time.
Hey,
thanks.
Ryan. Thank you.
Good fun. Hey, nice to meet you. How are you?
Hey. Repeat your claim one more time.
That suffering is unexpected if a good God exists.
Unexpected. So when you say unexpected, like you're caught off guard by it, or you're expecting like all good things to happen.
That if I assume that there is a good God supervising, invigilating the universe, that I would not expect to see so much suffering.
Right.
So much gratuitous, seemingly unnecessary suffering.
Right. And you know, the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
I would say that there can be sort of poetically, you can look at suffering and think that's a beautiful story, but I don't think that the person suffering, especially if they die as a direct result, might think that. Also, I think that if I knew someone whose child died of leukemia and suffered for it,
right,
and I went to them and said, but hey, there's some beauty in the suffering, isn't there? I think I'd be kicked out of the funeral.
Right. Well, I would say like the same thing for a woman giving birth, right? It's suffering, like it sucks, it hurts.
Sure. But imagine you could have the giving birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
You might prefer it in the moment, but that doesn't mean that it's the best for you.
Of course, yeah, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff, then there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff. So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right. Well, could you say that the result of why we suffer is because of fall of man?
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of man.
Right, true.
But I also don't think that explains non-human animal suffering. The big thing that I want to keep pressing is that the theodicies that we talk about, free will, fall of man, all of this kind of stuff, I don't think applies to that deer with its leg caught under the branch that's dying in confused agony. What's this for?
So what is it about animals that seems so like more important than a human?
It's not that they're more
suffering?
important. It's that, as you say, like it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the poetry of suffering. Animals can't do that.
Right.
Animals can't enjoy the poetry of suffering.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I never like talked to an animal and said like, hey.
I have. They just haven't talked back. It's the problem. But I just don't see why we would expect that God would oversee this system of natural selection.
Right.
Billions of animals suffering and dying, predation, disease, eating each other alive, leaving each other to bleed out on the floor. And this is being supervised by an all-loving God.
Well, do you think that's God's intention from the very beginning of creation of all things?
I think that God oversees the mechanism. God could have made it, for example, one example that I've already given, is that God could have made animals herbivores, which just eliminates the problem of predation.
I mean, there are some animals.
There are, but he could have made more of them. He could have made all animals herbivores, thereby eliminating the suffering of predation.
So is the issue them eating each other?
That's one issue. That's one way that God could have sort of, I think, quite trivially reduced the amount of suffering.
Even that doesn't work, because then we would eat animals, right? Or I guess he could make us herbivores too, but then why make animals at that point? Like
Attenborough once said of his documentaries, people who complain that we put too much violence in the documentaries should see what we leave in the cutting room floor. The animal world is just filled with unimaginable suffering. Just predation is
But there's also cute things about, like, otters holding hands so they don't swim away.
Could you have that without suffering? That's the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good fun.
So obviously, Alex is a very, very skilled debater and a very, very skilled philosopher. But is he right? And is there no argument that can overmatch his? I believe that there are several arguments that I would immediately bring up to counter his claim. The first one is the premise of unlikelihood, right? He says that suffering in a world with an omni-benevolent God is unlikely. Well, my first question to him would be, what gets you to that probabilistic calculation, right? How is it? Because it seems like somewhere in this configuration, this calculation, he's doing some math, and it's like, yeah, probability of this isn't high, but based on what? We have exactly one data point. We have one data point, and that's the data point of the universe, right? We don't have any other universes with which to use as a frame of reference for the one that we're in. So, like, to see one data point and only one data point doesn't really mean much. And that, like, let's say that there were, I don't believe in the many possible worlds theory necessarily, but let's say that they exist. Let's say you had this whole spectrum of possible worlds that God could create. Everything from, lots of suffering over here to not much suffering over here, right? Like, or no suffering over here, right? And God just kind of like plucks one out and chooses to make this one. Now, the problem I have with that is if you're talking about quote unquote unlikely, well, out of these infinite worlds, any single result would be unlikely. It would be one out of infinite, right? It would be an improbable selection. But that's based on the concept that, but relatively, it's not any less likely or more likely than any of the others. Because if let's say you've got 1 million different possibilities in the spectrum, every single possibility is going to have precisely 1 out of 1 million chances of happening. So I don't know where he's doing this calculation of saying this is unlikely, unexpected. Like I said before in the beginning, the odds of, us having a universe at all seems like the innately unexpected outcome, if and only if you have a God that has the benevolence to want to create. And absent that, I'm not sure that you would see a universe at all. But again, I have only one data point too. Now, I personally subscribe to what I call the perfect world theory. And I don't know that that this has a philosophical name. I'm sure it does. I wish that I was learned enough to know it. But the perfect world theory is this. Essentially, God can only act perfectly. And as a consequence, when he creates, he can only create perfectly. Now, that means that the universe that we live in, I believe, to be fully 100% optimized as a creation. Now, it may not seem like it's optimized again for the values that we have, right? That's what the guy in the first conversation was talking about. There's a mismatch in values, right? From Alex O'Connor's value system, who prizes animal suffering, like who prizes animal pleasure very highly, deprioritizes animal suffering very strongly. That could seem like not the value that he would have used had he created the universe. But it's important to note that we can't impose our morality onto God, right? That's one of those things where it just doesn't work. Our morality was given to us for us, right? It only works within the scope that we exist in, right? And if you go outside that scope, if you become God, then you'd have a different set of priorities altogether, right? More like, I'll give you this example. One example is, if let's say you had a situation where, for example, I was thinking about whether or not I should wipe the whole world out in a flood. Does this story sound familiar? Right? Now, I wouldn't do this because I can't be trusted with that kind of responsibility. I don't know everything that will happen throughout the end of time. I don't know if the people in the world that I would be wiping out with the flood, if each and every single one of them, minus, 8 for Noah's family, if each and every single one of them truly does deserve my punishment, because I can't track, that many lives. And I can't track those lives over time and all of the generations after to come and the generations after that and after that, and after that, on down to infinity. I can't track that. Now God can, and that's why he can be trusted to make those decisions. And moreover, he can be trusted. He has the information necessary to make a good decision. So that's why I subscribe to this whole perfect world theory. I think that if you're looking at a world, a universe that God created, and you already know that this universe is likely to have a creator just based on the fact that it is in existence, then at that point, you basically have to subscribe to the fact that this is a perfectly optimized universe, if you assume that God is omni-benevolent. So part of this too is a reverse logic chain too. So what Alex O'Connor is doing is he's starting with the value that he doesn't want animals to suffer, and then is tracking out to say that God isn't benevolent. But in reality, you'd have to start from the other end. You'd have to start with God is benevolent, therefore the exact amount of suffering necessary does actually exist, because otherwise, the benevolent God wouldn't have made it that way. The reason I think that suffering is necessary is for a variety of reasons. For one of them, I think that the guy in the first conversation had a little bit right when he said that God doesn't necessarily get in, his hands on like that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that God has the ability to work a miracle and the ability to work divine intervention, but it's not his style, right? That's not the nature of God. It's not the nature of God isn't to get involved every 5 seconds and tie our shoes for us, right? The nature of God is he made a great creation. Now man is the steward of that creation, and it's our job to make sure that that creation flourishes. It's not necessarily God's job, although he sustains it all the time. He wants us to take that responsibility. Now, can he do it? Yes. And so one question, of course, that's constantly defeated is like, could God have otherwise made the universe in exactly the same fashion, except for one deer that suffered didn't have to suffer? Maybe he could, maybe that is the better thing to do, but maybe I doubt it. I doubt it that it's better. I doubt that we're living in anything other than the optimal configuration with precisely the amount of suffering that that he knows to be the case, past, present, and future. And you never know when that deer being trapped by that tree branch is there to feed a pack of wolves who is there that would have starved otherwise, and that pack of wolves is there to make sure that the forest doesn't get overpopulated with a certain part of the ecosystem, which keeps the ecosystem in balance, which then leads to humans having more flourishing. So it could all be for us still. Like, there's really no way to perfectly map that it isn't. Yeah. So that's what I got for you. Definitely hit me up and let me know in the comment section what you think. This is, like I said, this is kind of some advanced philosophy. So, and philosophers go back and forth on this stuff all day long, and it goes in circles. It never ends. But I am interested in hearing what you guys have to say. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll catch you next time on Common Mansplaining.